Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Fall Start Fantasy Podcast with your host, Cameron Edgecombe. Today I will be sharing my veteran wide receiver theory that will prevent us from drafting the next Kenny Galladay. Since 2019, 19 wide receivers have been drafted in the first round of the NFL draft. And while not all of them have been Justin Jefferson, some of them have made major impacts on fantasy football. Now, while I wish I had a foolproof way of looking at which of these rookies would be stars and which would be duds, what I actually have is a model for predicting their veteran teammates. There are a few reasons why a team would draft a wide receiver in the first round of the NFL draft. They either want to replace their current wide receiver one, or they want to complement them. Luckily for us, fantasy football players already know which category they will fall into. We just haven't been looking at it right. Before I begin, let me explain my sample data. I used myfantasyleague.com to collect the top 80 wide receivers drafted in 12-team PPR redraft fantasy football league since 2019. From there, I removed any player that did not play at least 10 games due to injury or otherwise, and this gave me a sample size of 249 wide receivers out of a total possible 320. Of those 249, I separated them into two categories. Very simply put, there are either the good players and the bad players. Wide receivers whose positional ADP have them drafted in the top 24 of all wide receivers that year in fantasy football are good players. And those who are outside of the top 24 are bad players. Now, there are two other groups that fall immediately into one of those two categories already. And they are the replaced veterans and the complemented veterans. To be a complemented vet, you need to have a teammate drafted in the first round of that year's NFL draft, and you need to be a good player or have an ADP within the top 24 wide receivers. Since 2019, we have had 6 of those who stayed healthy. To be a replaced vet, you need to once again have a teammate drafted in the first round of that year's NFL draft. However, you also need to be a bad player or to be drafted outside of the top 24 wide receivers. To qualify as a veteran for these two groups, you also needed to be the top wide receiver drafted in fantasy football that was not the rookie wide receiver on the same team. So while Devonta Smith was drafted ahead of Jalen Reagor in 2021, Reagor still gets credit as the veteran player, as he was the top Eagles wide receiver drafted that year. This is where our graph comes in. On the x-axis, we have the positional average draft position of every wide receiver drafted since 2019 that played at least 10 games. On the y-axis, we have where the player finished minus their positional ADP. So if we look at 2020's Darius Slayton, we can see he was drafted as wide receiver 45, so his place on the x-axis, and he finished as the wide receiver 54, so he is at 45 minus 9. Let's take a look at our groups. Every player that is to the left of the red line is a good player, and to the right is a bad player, just a reminder. The green diamonds are good players who are not complemented veterans, and the green X's are bad players that are not replaced veterans, which are the blue squares and the yellow triangles. So let's compare our 6 complemented veteran players to their good counterparts, since both groups are drafted in the top 24 wide receivers. The complemented veterans finish on average 3.7 spots above where they are drafted. The good players finish on average 7.3 spots below where they are drafted. The complemented veterans have at worst finished 6 spots below where they were drafted, whereas the good players have finished as low as 71 spots below. Shout out to 2021's Allen Robinson, wide receiver 12, drafted to his finish at wide receiver 83. And for some reason in 2022, people were drafting him again. Drafting players from both groups has a positive trend line, as you can see by the lines, the blue and the light green there. The wide receivers since 2019 who fit into this veteran, complemented veteran status are 2019 Julian Edelman, 2020 Amari Cooper and Adam Thielen, 2021 T. Higgins, and then from 2022 Terry McLaurin and Amon-Ra St. Brown. All of those players finished above where you'd expect if they had just been good players. Now, while this is a very small sample size, I do believe there is a future to looking at this next year. Now let's look at the replaced veterans and really the reason why I created this study. The replaced veterans and their bad counterparts have a lot of similarities in that there is a pretty wide range of expectations what you can expect. Due to being drafted later, it is possible for them to finish way higher despite actually not finishing in a good spot. Players drafted outside of the top 24 have a very large range of outcomes, and if the team they're on drafted a wide receiver in the first round of that year's NFL draft, then the veteran has been replaced and you need to get away from them fast. Some notable wide receivers from this group include 2022's Elijah Moore. When Garrett Wilson was added to the team, the hope was that he would complement Moore and they'd both be awesome. But Moore's wide receiver 37 ADP should have warned us that he was a landmine, and he finished as a wide receiver 80. 2020's Kenny Golladay was supposed to be a Stephon Diggs-like veteran who would dominate with Kadarius Toney on his side. Instead, he was a massive disappointment who turned his wide receiver 30 draft capital into the wide receiver 80 spot. And the biggest failure of all was 2019's Chris Moore. Moore was supposed to work with incoming rookie Marquise Brown to assist with Lamar Jackson on what would become his NFL MVP year. But instead, Moore ended up with only 21 yards on the season, returning his wide receiver 59 draft capital into wide receiver 188. Before moving on, I did want to give a special shout out to Brian Edwards, who was almost on this list twice. Once for 2020 with Henry Ruggs on the Raiders, again this season on the Falcons with Drake London. However, he was released by the Falcons this year and only ended up playing 7 games, so I decided not to put him on here twice. Now, those of you who are paying attention will also notice that there is one player who is on the replaced veterans group, yet did not finish below expectation, and that is 2021's Marquise Brown. After a mediocre 2 seasons with the Ravens, the team decided to bring in another wide receiver to help Lamar with Rashod Bateman. Brown responded with 6 touchdowns and over 1,000 yards, good enough to finish as a wide receiver 17 despite his wide receiver 49 draft spot. Brown remains the only wide receiver since 2019 to return anywhere close to positive value in the replaced veterans group, with the second best season being Robert Woods' 2022 season, where he turned his wide receiver 43 draft spot into a wide receiver 60 finish. Now, I know a lot of people will attribute some of this to the wide receiver that was set to replace the veteran. However, the talent or injury status of the incoming player doesn't appear to affect the veteran at all. Guys like Kadarius Toney, Treylon Burks, and Brandon Ayuk could barely get on the field in year 1, yet their veteran counterparts all returned terribly on their draft capital. Whereas on the good player side, Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb hardly slowed down Adam Thielen and Amari Cooper at all in their first years. To boil this all down to a single concept, when an NFL team drafts a wide receiver in the first round of the NFL draft, they are either destroying the value of the wide receiver 1 they already have there, or they are almost guaranteeing them success. The way we can tell is by looking at their ADP. Veteran wide receivers whose ADP is within the top 24 will return very closely on that investment, whereas veteran wide receivers whose ADP is outside of the top 24 will almost certainly crash miserably and take your fantasy football team with them. I would be especially wary for those who are interested in Christian Watson, and Mike Williams or Keenan Allen, as those two teams have been mocked wide receivers a ton already in the 2023 NFL draft. And if they are not top 24 picks, I would very much be worried about where they can go. That concludes my veteran wide receiver theory. Thank you so much for listening to the False Start Fantasy Podcast. If you have any questions, shoot them to me on Twitter at FalseStartFPod. Tune in next time so you can be ready before the ball is snapped. Thank you and goodbye.